June 14th, 2026, and I have been trying to find the right words to open this video for the last 20 minutes, because what has just happened is the kind of moment that you spend an entire career in military aviation and national security analysis waiting to see, and when it finally arrives, you want to make sure you do it justice. So let me just say it plainly, and then we are going to spend the next several thousand words unpacking exactly what it means and exactly how we got here. Iran has agreed to hand over its enriched uranium stockpile. The regime that has spent the better part of 3 decades telling the world that its nuclear program is non-negotiable, that uranium enrichment is an Iranian sovereign right, that no amount of sanctions or military pressure or diplomatic engagement will ever cause them to relinquish. The regime that built underground mountain facilities specifically to protect that program from American and Israeli air power. The regime that has launched ballistic missiles at Israel and American bases and Gulf partner nations, and basically everyone within range, while insisting that it would never bow to coercion. That regime just agreed to hand over its enriched uranium to a third-party custodian as part of a framework deal that also addresses the Strait of Hormuz, the blockade, the frozen assets, and the future status of Iranian military capabilities in the Gulf. This is not a rumor. This is not a trial balloon being floated through a back channel. This is a confirmed framework agreement that has been announced simultaneously by the Qatari government, which has been the primary intermediary throughout the final negotiating phase, and by the White House, which put out a statement from President Trump within the last several hours that I am going to read to you in full because every word of it matters. So stay with me through this entire video because the details of what has been agreed to, the military and intelligence backstory of how the pressure campaign produced this outcome, the questions that remain unanswered about verification and implementation, and the strategic implications for the broader regional and global order are all enormously important, and we are going to cover all of it. And then in the global roundup section, we have developments out of the Pacific and out of Eastern Europe that you need to understand in the context of this agreement, because the Iran deal does not exist in a vacuum. And what happens in those theaters in the next several days is going to tell us a great deal about whether this moment represents a genuine turning point or the beginning of a new and more complex phase of great power competition. Let me start with what is actually in the agreement, because the details matter more than the headlines, and the details are where you find out whether this is a genuine strategic achievement or a piece of paper that looks good for 48 hours and then falls apart on implementation. The framework, as it has been described, has several core components. First, Iran agrees to transfer its entire stockpile of enriched uranium, including both its low-enriched uranium inventory and whatever remains of its higher-enriched material, to a third-party custodian. The country that has been named in the reporting as the custodian is Oman, which has played a quiet but genuinely important role in the diplomatic architecture of this conflict throughout its duration. Oman has maintained relationships with both Washington and Tehran throughout the Gulf crisis, in a way that almost no other country in the region has managed to do, and its willingness to serve as the physical custodian of Iranian enriched uranium is a significant commitment that reflects both the trust that Tehran has in Muscat and the confidence that Washington has placed in the Omani government to fulfill this role reliably. The uranium transfer is not supposed to happen all at once. There's a phased timeline that runs over approximately 90 days, with the first tranche of material moving within 30 days of the agreement being signed and verified, and subsequent tranches following on a schedule that is tied to Iranian compliance with other elements of the deal. Second component. Iran agrees to a comprehensive suspension of uranium enrichment activities at all declared facilities, including Fordo, Natanz, and the additional sites that have been identified through the intelligence and inspection process throughout this conflict. The suspension is not described as permanent, which is going to be a significant point of political debate in the coming days, both in the United States and in Israel. It is described as an indefinite suspension subject to a new negotiating framework that will address the long-term parameters of any Iranian civilian nuclear program going forward. Now, I want to be honest with you about what that language means and does not mean. An indefinite suspension is not the same as dismantlement. It is not the same as a permanent prohibition on enrichment. It leaves open the theoretical possibility that Iran could at some future point resume enrichment activities under a negotiated framework. But here is the practical reality that the indefinite suspension combined with the uranium transfer creates. If Iran hands over its enriched material and suspends its enrichment activities, the breakout timeline, the time it would take Iran to produce enough weapons-grade material for a nuclear device if it decided to restart everything, goes from weeks or months to years. Because you cannot make a bomb with uranium you have already handed to Oman, and you cannot make a bomb quickly with enrichment infrastructure that has been suspended, partially destroyed by last week's B-2 strikes, and subject to a verification regime with actual teeth. The indefinite suspension is not everything that the most hawkish voices in Washington and Jerusalem wanted. But the combination of the suspension and the material transfer creates a fundamentally different nuclear risk environment than anything that existed before this conflict began. Third component, the Strait of Hormuz. Iran agrees to formally recognize the international legal status of the strait as international waters through which all nations have rights of innocent passage, and to withdraw the so-called Persian Gulf Strait Authority's claim to control the waterway. In exchange, the US-led blockade on Iranian oil exports is lifted in phases, with the pace of lifting tied to Iranian compliance with the other elements of the agreement. The first phase of blockade relief comes with the first uranium transfer. The full lifting of the blockade comes with the completion of the 90-day uranium transfer timeline and the full implementation of the Strait Status Agreement. This is a genuinely significant piece of the deal because the Strait of Hormuz question has been the immediate practical flashpoint of this entire conflict. Iranian harassment of commercial shipping, the Mosquito Fleet fast attack boat operations, the drone attacks on vessels transiting the strait, all of those have been enabled by Iran's claim to some form of control over the waterway. Formally renouncing that claim, and the operational posture that went with it, is not just a legal nicety. It is the thing that makes the strait operationally safe for commercial shipping, in a way that it has not been for the past several months. Fourth component, the frozen assets. Iran gets phased access to the $24 billion in frozen funds, again tied to compliance benchmarks rather than as a lump sum upfront payment. The sequencing here is important because it means that Iran does not get the financial relief it desperately needs unless it is actually implementing the other elements of the agreement. The leverage that the frozen assets represent does not disappear the moment the deal is signed. It is dispersed gradually in direct proportion to Iranian compliance, which means the incentive structure for Iran to actually do what it says it is going to do remains in place throughout the implementation period. Fifth component, and this one is the piece that I think is going to generate the most debate. There's language in the framework about the future of Iranian proxy relationships and the IRGC's external operations. The language is described as aspirational rather than binding in its current form, which is a diplomatic way of saying that the harder problem of Iranian support for Hezbollah and the Houthis and other proxy organizations has been acknowledged as an issue but has not been resolved in this agreement. It is kicked to a subsequent negotiating track, and that is going to be a source of significant criticism from people who believe, with good reason, that a deal that addresses the nuclear program and the strait but leaves the proxy network intact has not actually resolved the fundamental destabilizing role that Iran plays in the region. I share some of that concern, and I am going to come back to it in the strategic analysis section. But I also want to be fair about what this agreement does accomplish, because dismissing it because it does not accomplish everything would be allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the genuinely significant. Now let me walk you through the pressure campaign backstory, because this agreement did not fall from the sky, and the story of how the military and intelligence operations of the last 2 weeks produced this outcome is genuinely one of the most instructive case studies in coercive diplomacy that I have seen in my career. Go back to the Apache shootdown on Monday evening. That was the triggering event. The Shahed drone that brought down the AH-64 over the Strait of Hormuz was not just a tragedy for the crew, who thank God both survived. It was the action that unlocked a level of American military response that the Iranian regime had been calculating America would not be willing to execute. Iran's strategic bet for months had been that America would calibrate its responses carefully enough that the regime could continue its harassment operations, continue rebuilding its capabilities during ceasefire windows, and continue running out the clock on negotiations while rebuilding leverage. The Apache shootdown broke that calculation open. The radar site strikes that followed showed Iran that its ability to see and coordinate around the strait was going to be systematically dismantled. The Karg Island operation showed Iran that the financial architecture of the regime was now inside the target ring. The B-2 strikes with GBU-57s against Fordo, and the underground missile storage facilities showed Iran that the mountain was no longer safe. And the cartel operation, while geographically unrelated to Iran, was the clearest possible signal to every adversary watching that the political constraints on American military action that had previously been treated as fixed had become variable in ways that nobody could predict with confidence. Each of those operations built on the previous one in a sequencing that I now believe was deliberate and was planned with the negotiating endgame in mind. Because the targeting choices throughout this campaign were not random. They were chosen specifically to maximize pressure on the elements of Iranian power that the regime cares most about, in an order that escalated the cost of continued non-compliance in the most direct possible way. The Qatari back channel was active throughout this entire sequence. And here is the thing about coercive diplomacy that most people who have not studied it closely do not fully appreciate. The military pressure and the diplomatic engagement are not separate tracks that happen in parallel. They are integrated instruments that work together, where the military actions inform the diplomatic conversations by changing what the party under pressure believes is possible if they do not reach an agreement. Every strike in this campaign was